They weren't looking for a lake. No one came to Antarctica to uncover a hidden world. They came here to read the past. At Vostok Station, one of the coldest, most isolated places ever inhabited by humans, scientists were drilling straight down into the ice, not out of curiosity, but necessity. They were extracting ice cores, frozen layers stacked like pages in a history book, each one recording Earth's climate tens of thousands of years at a time. The deeper they drilled, the older the planet became. This was careful, methodical science. No risks, no surprises, just data. But kilometer after kilometer down, something started to feel wrong. The ice below wasn't behaving like ice should. Radar signals reflected too cleanly. Seismic waves flattened out, as if they were passing over something smooth, not solid. At first, it was dismissed as noise. Equipment error, interpretation bias. But the anomalies didn't go away. They lined up. And slowly, an impossible idea began to form. What if this wasn't ice at all? What if, buried beneath nearly 4 kilometers of frozen silence, there was liquid water, trapped, sealed, and completely cut off from the surface world? That question changed everything. Because drilling for climate data is one thing, but drilling toward a sealed environment, one that might have been isolated for millions of years, is something else entirely. This was no longer just a scientific mission. It was a decision about how far humans should go and whether some places on Earth were never meant to be touched at all. And once that line appeared, there was no way to pretend it wasn't there. At first, the signals were subtle. Radar pulses sent down through the ice came back cleaner than expected, too clean. Not scattered, not fractured, as if they had reflected off something flat and smooth. Then the seismic data followed. Waves that should have slowed, bent, or broken simply passed through, gliding uninterrupted, like they were crossing liquid instead of solid ground. That's when the pattern became impossible to ignore. This wasn't a pocket. It wasn't meltwater trapped in cracks, and it definitely wasn't noise. Layer by layer, kilometer by kilometer, the data began to outline something vast. A body of water stretching beneath the ice, longer than some of the Great Lakes on the surface. Completely buried, completely sealed. No sunlight, no contact with the atmosphere, no exchange with the outside world. If the models were right, this lake had been locked away for an almost unimaginable length of time. Not centuries, not thousands of years, millions. And suddenly, the project at Vostok was no longer just about climate records. Because discovering a lake under Antarctica wasn't the real shock. The shock was what that lake represented. A place on Earth that modern humans had never touched. A system that evolved, or didn't, without us. And standing above it, with a drill pointed straight down, the scientists realized something unsettling. They weren't just studying the planet anymore. They were standing at the edge of something untouched. And the next move they made would decide whether it stayed that way. The moment Lake Vostok became real, the mission split in two. On one side was curiosity, the kind that drives science forward, the kind that asks what has survived in total darkness, under crushing pressure, for millions of years. On the other side was fear. Not fear of what might be found, but fear of what might be lost. Because the drill wasn't sterile. To keep the borehole from collapsing and freezing shut, engineers used drilling fluids, chemicals never meant to touch a sealed environment. One mistake, one leak, one uncontrolled contact, and whatever existed below the ice would never be the same again. If Lake Vostok was a closed system, then contamination wouldn't just be damage. It would be permanent. That's when the arguments began. Some scientists believed the opportunity was too important to delay. Others warned that this wasn't exploration, it was intrusion. International committees stepped in. Guidelines were written. Words like irreversible and ethical responsibility entered conversations that had once been purely technical. For the first time, the question wasn't how deep they could drill. It was whether they had the right to continue at all. Standing above the lake, with only a thin column of ice separating them from an untouched world, the team faced a decision no machine could make for them. Advance or stop. And whatever choice they made would define the mission, not by what it discovered, but by what it chose not to destroy. From the surface, the drill looked precise, controlled, almost delicate. But kilometers below the ice, precision becomes fragile. To keep the borehole open in temperatures far below freezing, the team relied on drilling fluids, chemicals designed to prevent collapse and refreezing. They worked perfectly for ice. They were never designed for a sealed lake. If even a small amount leaked downward, it wouldn't just mix with water. It would rewrite the chemistry of an environment that had never known the modern world. And if life existed there, even the simplest microbial form, contamination wouldn't kill it instantly. It would erase the evidence that it was ever different. That was the real risk. Not a dramatic catastrophe, not an explosion or a collapse, but something quieter, something permanent, a mistake that future science could never undo. As awareness spread, the project stopped being just Russian or just Antarctic. It became international. Scientists who had never set foot at Vostok began weighing in. Protocols were drafted, safeguards debated. Some argued that technology could be adapted. Others insisted that any direct entry was already too dangerous. And hovering over every discussion was a single question. If humanity had finally reached a place that time itself had sealed away, did we have the right to open it? Because once the drill crossed that final boundary, there would be no way to close it again. By the time the drill reached more than 3.5 kilometers below the surface, the decision was no longer theoretical. Antarctica was closing in. At Vostok Station, seasons don't change gently. They snap. Temperatures plunge. Supply routes disappear. Aircraft stop flying. If the team stayed too long, there would be no rescue window. And so, in early February, with the borehole hovering just a short distance above the lake itself, the order was given. Stop drilling. Not because the equipment broke, not because the data was unclear, but because continuing would risk lives, and possibly the lake itself. The drill was shut down, the site was secured, and the scientists left, knowing exactly how close they were. Less than 100 meters separated them from one of the most isolated bodies of water on Earth. For some, it felt like walking away from history. For others, it felt like restraint, the kind science rarely practices. Above the ice, the world barely noticed. But beneath it, nothing had changed. The lake remained sealed, untouched, waiting. And in that pause, forced by weather, logistics, and responsibility, the mission entered its most dangerous phase. Because stopping was never the end. It was only buying time. And when they returned, they would have to decide whether stopping had been enough, or whether they were ready to cross the boundary they had avoided so far. When the team returned, nothing about the situation felt routine. The lake was still there. The risks were still unresolved. And the margin for error was now almost non-existent. This time, the goal wasn't to drill into Lake Vostok. It was to reach it and stop at the last possible moment. As the drill cut through the final meters of ice, pressure beneath the surface began to matter more than depth. The lake below was under enormous force, trapped beneath kilometers of frozen weight. And then contact. The drill broke through the final barrier, and water from the lake surged upward into the borehole, pushed by pressure alone. No pumps, no extraction. Within seconds, the water began to freeze. It rose, slowed, and locked itself in place, forming a solid plug of ice inside the shaft. That was the plan. They didn't open the lake, they let the lake touch them. No drilling fluids were sent down. No equipment entered the water. What they had was indirect contact, a frozen sample created by the lake itself, not by human intrusion. To some, it felt anticlimactic. After decades of planning, they hadn't explored the lake at all. But to others, it was something far more important. Proof that it was possible to reach a sealed world without breaking it open. They had crossed the line physically, but not ethically. And in doing so, they arrived at the most fragile point of the entire mission. Because now the boundary wasn't theoretical anymore. It was real. Lake Vostok remained sealed. Not because humans lacked the technology, but because, for the first time, technology forced a question science wasn't ready to answer. If we can reach any place on Earth, who decides which ones should stay closed? The drill proves something irreversible. Not that Lake Vostok could be opened, but that it eventually will be. Maybe not by this team. Maybe not this decade, but someday. And when that moment comes, the question won't be what's down there. It will be why we're opening it at all. Because Lake Vostok isn't unique. There are other sealed lakes, other buried environments, other boundaries waiting for the right machine. And one day, similar worlds won't be hidden beneath ice. They'll be found beneath alien skies. When that happens, what will we do differently? Will we drill first and ask questions later? Or will Lake Vostok be remembered as the moment humanity realized that some discoveries aren't about finding answers, but about deciding whether we deserve them yet? That question is still open. And so is the door.